Hi everyone, thank you for attending my talk titled Responding to Crises on Campus, Past, Present, and a Vision for the Future. My name is Dr. Isabelle Lanser, and I am a Social Justice Policy Analyst at the UCLA Depression Grand Challenge. I received my PhD from UCLA in clinical psychology, and during my time in grad school, I worked with campus leaders to research ways to create a mobile crisis team on our campus. In addition to my work as a researcher, I'm also a therapist, and I'm passionate about expanding our crisis response infrastructure so that I can support the clients that I serve in the best way that I can when they need it the most. My hope is that after this talk today, everyone will leave having learned about the historical, legal, and cultural context of campus-provided mental health care. I also hope that you'll be able to evaluate the needs in your community and be able to identify the first steps to building an alternative response team on your campus. I first want to talk about the history of campus-run student health services. The first college health service was established in 1859 at Amherst College, and many colleges soon followed suit. These early programs provided students with basic care, which included yearly physicals, education about hygiene, vaccinations, and some routine medical care. In 1901, the University of California was one of the first colleges to develop a student health program that is the closest to what we see today. Throughout the mid to late 20th century, student health services expanded significantly, and by the 1980s, college-provided student health services were available to more than 80% of students in the U.S. With the expansion of student health services from basic first aid to comprehensive medical and mental health care, there were new, difficult legal, administrative, and ethical challenges for both campuses and their healthcare practitioners. On most campuses today, student health services fall under the umbrella of student affairs, which is the department on campus responsible for overseeing all aspects of student life outside of academics. This includes housing, student discipline and dismissal, financial support services, and accessible education. This means that practitioners on college campuses are responsible for not only the care of their individual clients, but the campus community as a whole. Campus safety and institutional responsibilities for the care of students has undergone several transformations. From the mid-1800s to the 1960s, courts upheld that American universities were acting in loco parentis with respect to their students. This is a legal doctrine that allows a temporary guardian or caretaker to take on all or some of the responsibilities of a parent, and it can apply to both government and non-government entities, including universities. Legal scholars Bickle and Lake stated, quote, "In its heyday, in loco parentis located power in the university, not in courts of law or in the students. In loco parentis promoted an image of the parental university and ensured that most problems were handled within the university, by the university, and often quietly." Ultimately, this doctrine placed decision-making control over student life with the university and afforded almost no constitutional protection to students. To highlight the control afforded to institutions at this time through this doctrine, I'd like to share a quote from the Supreme Court of Illinois' case in 1891 in North versus Board of Trustees of the University of Illinois. Quote, "By voluntarily entering the university or being placed there by those having the right to control him, he necessarily surrenders very many of his individual rights. How his time shall be occupied, what his habits shall be, his general deportment, that he shall not visit certain places, his hours of study and recreation. In all these matters and many others, he must yield obedience to those who, for the time being, are his masters." The civil rights movement of the 1960s reshaped the relationship between universities and their students and functionally ended in loco parentis. Courts began to rule in favor of students' constitutional protections, and colleges had a much more difficult time justifying their temporary parental status. What followed has been termed the bystander era, in which colleges were largely absolved of any liability for the actions and activities of their students. This quote from the Utah Supreme Court ruling in Beach versus University of Utah, 1986, demonstrates this drastic shift in court opinion. Quote, colleges and universities are educational institutions, not custodial. It would be unrealistic to impose on an institution of higher education the additional role of custodian over its adult students. Fulfilling this charge would require the institution to babysit each student, a task beyond the resources of any school. These two eras demonstrate the tension that underlies providing care to students and the challenges in determining who is responsible for both the care and safety of students today. The modern relationship between universities and their students has been characterized as the facilitator model, whereby universities are expected to support student development and maturation, set rules and limitations, and students are able to make their own choices and have their rights respected by the university. Tragedies such as the Virginia Tech massacre have posed a challenge for understanding campus responsibilities in this new, more ambiguous relationship. In recent years, the role and responsibility of campus mental health services expanded to include identifying and preventing campus violence. Additionally, the landmark Supreme Court of California ruling in Regents of California versus Catherine Rosen began the trend of swinging the pendulum back towards the middle when it comes to university responsibility in terms of ensuring students' rights. This ruling was critical in establishing the university's duty to protect students from foreseeable violence during curricular activities. This ruling clarified that a special relationship does exist between a college and its students, as students are, quote, comparatively vulnerable and dependent on their colleges for a safe environment. The court acknowledged that colleges are, quote, a unique environment unlike any other, end quote, given that universities provide a setting in which every aspect of student life is, to some degree, university guided. Given this special relationship, the court ruled that colleges have a duty to take reasonable steps to ensure student safety. An important question to ask, however, is which students get to be safe? Although the Americans with Disabilities Act safeguards the rights of students with mental disorders to receive an equitable and accessible education, out of an abundance of caution and in light of court rulings determining the university liability for actions of students known to universities as having significant mental health concerns that may impact others, universities are constantly balancing the safety of the students who may be impacted by another student's crisis and the student experiencing the crisis directly. There are several limitations to the current crisis response system that's in place at most universities. First, students experiencing emergency mental health crises are all but guaranteed to interact with law enforcement when their need for care is the greatest. The use of armed campus police officers to conduct student welfare checks and transport students to hospitals has the potential to escalate crises and affect clinical trajectories. At the time of crisis, the presence of an armed officer may be perceived as threatening and might heighten physiological arousal and psychological distress, especially if the individual who's in crisis identifies as being part of a marginalized group that has been disproportionately targeted by police violence. The experience of being handcuffed and escorted in the back of a police car to the hospital may be particularly traumatic for students of color, cementing the association between the treatment of mental illness and being detained and subjected to involuntary treatment in a confined and restricted environment. Additionally, long-term clinical outcomes could be negatively influenced by the compounded trauma of a significant mental health crisis and co-occurring police involvement. Specifically, the pervasive history of racial injustice and violence at the hand of law enforcement and the healthcare system against people of color may leave students of color, and particularly Black students, vulnerable to experiencing shame, social subordination, and powerlessness during or after a traumatic event. Although empirical data about these specific influences upon students of color are lacking, there is evidence to suggest that the experience of shame plays a unique pathogenic role in the development of traumatic stress disorders and has the potential to worsen treatment response and prevent recovery. Additionally, the current system is limited in its ability to provide adequate follow-up care. Students who require crisis intervention often need support navigating complex auxiliary, academic, personal health, or financial issues. An early connection to campus case management services is essential for preventing students in distress from experiencing significant legal or academic consequences, sanctions, or suspensions. However, campus case management services and administrative crisis response teams typically have limited availability to follow up on campus police cases. The consequences of the inability of these teams to follow up with students may include limited engagement with future health services, as punitive models can increase the likelihood that students delay access to care. Now that we've discussed the history of student health services, the legal and ethical considerations in providing care to students, and the limitations of the current system, I want to shift to what crisis response on campuses could look like. Many of you may be familiar with this quote by Angela Davis, which I believe captures the spirit of the work that's being done to build alternative mobile services to better support the mental health of all people. Quote, "Radical simply means grasping things at the root." I believe that mobile crisis intervention teams are the future of a holistic, robust, and equitable system of providing crisis services on college campuses. These teams are well suited to address many of the gaps in the current care system. Relative to law enforcement-only models, mobile response teams of mental professionals are extensively trained in de-escalation, have the appropriate training to assess both risk and treatment needs, and are better integrated with community supports for clients with psychiatric treatment needs beyond inpatient hospitalization. Thanks undoubtedly to the work of members of this association and attendees today, several naturalistic comparison studies have examined the efficacy of these teams in community populations. Mobile crisis teams achieve higher rates of management of psychiatric emergency situations without hospitalization, lower costs per case, and lower rates of hospitalization within 30 days of crisis. In 2021, the University of California Office of the President issued a UC campus safety plan that outlined revisions to system-wide UC campus safety protocols and included a mandate for each campus to implement a holistic, tiered response service that includes mobile crisis response teams. I want to spotlight two of those teams today. The first is the UC Santa Cruz Campus Mobile Crisis Team. This is the first team that was developed on a UC campus. It launched in 2022 and is housed in UC Santa Cruz's Counseling and Psychological Services Department and is completely separate from the campus police department. The team has a flexible relationship with campus law enforcement, and during the soft launch of the team, they reported that of the 50 calls they received between October 2022 and March 2023, law enforcement accompanied the team 8 times and were ultimately only needed 4 times. This team plans to soon include 2 EMTs in addition to their intervention specialists, which will allow the team to begin operating 7 days a week. Additionally, this year, UC San Diego launched its mobile crisis team called Triton Core, which stands for Triton Compassionate Response Team. This team is housed within the UCSD Police Department and currently only responds to nonviolent emergencies. The program is still in its pilot phase and has limited operational hours. The team uses a flexible response model, which allows for teams of mental health practitioners, police officers, or a combination to be dispatched as needed depending on the level of threat determined by dispatch. Dispatch will typically inform callers of which team will be arriving. The team's mission statement says that it operates from a trauma-informed lens and emphasizes a collaborative racial disability justice and multicultural responsive approach. Additionally, and notably, the team is able to transport students to emergency services without the use of restraints, and members of the team will support students throughout the hospital intake process and stay with them until they're admitted. The team also provides post-vention support and referral support and connection. There's a lot to learn from these models of campus crisis response teams and the many examples of community-based teams that other campuses can draw upon. First, campuses should let the definition of crisis determine the response model. Mobile crisis intervention teams vary widely in the extent to which they use local law enforcement in response, and most frequently make that determination on a case-by-case basis, driven by the relative risk of violence towards a first responder. There appears to be little reason to utilize a strict law enforcement co-responder model if the teams plan to primarily respond to situations where they can confirm the lack of presence of a weapon prior to deployment or the risk of imminent violence towards others is low. For the majority of college campuses, a medic mental health professional co-responder model may serve students far better. Secondly, flexible relationships with local campus police departments are critical. Whether a campus chooses to embed law enforcement into its mobile crisis team or not, it's imperative that the relationship with campus police remains flexible and that the determination of whether an officer needs to be present at the scene is based on how safe the crisis team responders feel at the time of dispatch. There's little to no research on reliability of decision-making behavior on crisis team responders in determining potential risk, although there is evidence that some mobile crisis intervention teams generally feel comfortable responding to calls without police intervention more often than not. Avoiding having law enforcement mandated to assist every mobile crisis intervention team call not only prevents the waste of community resources, but also remains faithful to the vision of providing a true alternative to policing on campus. The last takeaway I want to emphasize is that a robust community human services network is necessary for the success of a mobile crisis team. Cahoots is an excellent case example as the organization attributes much of its success to the City of Eugene's simultaneous investment in human services over the last 50 years. Universities must consider how they will manage the co-expansion of their local service network alongside the development of a campus mobile crisis team. Though more research is needed, there is evidence that mobile crisis intervention teams and a robust human services network mitigate mental health care costs in the long run through reducing utilization of emergency room visits, law enforcement, and emergency services overall. Further, the investment in both a mobile crisis team and the expansion of local community service networks is in line with most universities' missions to create, disseminate, preserve, and apply knowledge for the betterment of our global society. Universities have the opportunity to improve the relationship between societal institutions and those experiencing crisis through these developments, and the price of innovating in this space is minimal compared to the cost of lagging behind in making these necessary advancements. Conducting a comprehensive community needs assessment is the first step of undertaking the challenge of creating a campus crisis response team. To do so, you'll need to systematically identify the needs, assets, and gaps in your existing care system. Implementation scientists at your college or local campuses in your area may be able to support this assessment in order to gather robust qualitative and quantitative community data. You might also consider what data your campus is already gathering that can be used to support your initial assessment. Speaking to community healthcare providers, including your local hospitals, as well as local emergency teams, may also be a helpful way of gathering data that can speak to the full range of services that may be available to students, faculty, and staff at your institution. After conducting the needs assessment, there are several steps campuses should consider if they're interested in developing their own team. First, it's imperative to identify your primary stakeholders and champions at your institutions. These stakeholders likely include, but are not limited to, Student Affairs Administration, campus counseling and psychological services, students, psychology and psychiatry department leaders, institutional lawyers, and leaders within your local healthcare system that's most closely associated with your university. Additionally, in order to build a flexible relationship with the campus police department, a decision needs to be made early on regarding the role of campus police in the development of this team and the role of campus police as a primary stakeholder. Next, I encourage you to think about trying to identify possible sources of funding. Depending on the proposed population served by your team, various funding avenues may be available, and your university system may allow you to access funds earmarked for student health services. Further, different funding streams may be available through different stakeholders. For example, psychology and psychiatry department leaders may be able to access research grant funding if the mobile crisis team is set up in collaboration with data collection efforts. At the beginning stages of the development, it may also be helpful to begin thinking about the ways in which funding can be secured to expand your human services network in conjunction with the development of the mobile crisis team. Additionally, because health services are governed by a series of interconnected and sometimes conflicting state, federal, county, and institutional legal and ethical mandates, a thorough assessment of the laws in your area that are relevant to the provision of emergency services is essential. Lastly, building a true alternative to policing in mental health crises requires extensive planning and clear implementation phases and targets. Managing the relationship between the mobile crisis team, campus stakeholders, and campus police will require clear benchmarks for assessing the implementation of the team. For example, what do campus stakeholders need to see before they're ready to expand the service area of the team from, let's say, the student counseling center to on-campus housing to off-campus housing? Setting up service utilization and outcome monitoring early on in the development of your team is the best way to ensure consistency in target tracking throughout all implementation phases. There are several potential challenges associated with implementing campus-based mobile crisis teams that need to be acknowledged. First, establishing a team and expanding the available mental health service infrastructure on campuses may lead to what policy experts dub the wrong pockets problem, wherein the organization that bears the expenditures does not receive the primary financial benefit of the program. The wrong pockets problem often leads to the loss of useful services because the cost of the program is not recouped by the program itself. To avoid this, universities should outline how the implementation of a mobile crisis team might benefit other campus entities so that the cost of implementation is shared equally throughout the university healthcare and crisis response infrastructure. Another potential challenge universities will need to contend with is how to provide equitable access for all students. Given the variety of living arrangements for university students, campuses will need to determine how they can support students who do not live in the immediate local area, as well as how to address crises that may involve partnering with their local department of mental health services and community care networks, so that a wider network of care is available to all students, regardless of insurance status. Lastly, given that establishing a campus crisis team involves extensive shifts in existing university crisis management systems, there are likely to be several challenges and limitations that are unique to each campus that you may not be able to anticipate. The establishment of an interdisciplinary development and oversight committee with a wide breadth of expertise is necessary to collaborate on these challenges. The progress that has been made in bringing mobile crisis teams to college campuses in the last 3 years is exciting, encouraging, and above all else, radical. Thank you for your time and attention throughout this presentation. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to me at drisabellanser@gmail.com. I hope you enjoy the rest of this conference.